This discussion is very important, regardless of the time we're in, but it's really especially urgent right now, I think, for a number of reasons. The huge disruptions, in the infant and maternal healthcare systems that were caused by the pandemic and that really continue to ripple through the systems today. Water safety crises, like the one in Jackson, Mississippi that came to people's attention last year. Again, I think a lot of journalists haven't quite focused on that a water safety issue is actually an infant feeding crisis. And of course, Mississippi is already the state that has the worst breastfeeding rates in the country and the worst outcomes for maternal health, women's health, infant health, everybody's health. Then, of course, there's the infant formula safety crisis that led to the shortages last year in the US. And then I think there have been a lot of attacks, obviously, by lawmakers and by courts on women's health, reproductive health, and basic health care, right? And I think, again, we've been thinking a lot about how those laws and changes in the law in the US are affecting women's health, but what we forgot is that they actually affect baby's health, right? There's the downstream is going to be, and probably is already profoundly important for infants. And then, of course, on top of everything, there's climate change and the accelerating climate change crisis and how that is magnifying, intensifying, worsening, complicating all the other crises that we're dealing with around feeding and around food security and health security more broadly and health equity. So first, we're pleased to have 3 of the paper's authors here today. They will unpack the findings in general, and of course, then the unique way that they affect people in the US. And we're also later will be joined by 6 incredibly well-informed and experts and panelists and advocates who will help us understand more deeply the challenges that we face, that American families face around infant feeding. So before we get started, we just to remind you, a bit of housekeeping. This event is being recorded. It's going to be shared on the Global Breastfeeding Collective site, which you can see right here. So now first, we will hear from Fatmata Sise. Fatmata is a nutrition specialist in infant feeding here at UNICEF headquarters. She's also a mother of 3. She's graciously agreed to share her story, and so here she is. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from wherever you're joining us today, whether in person or online. I am honored to deliver a keynote address on behalf of UNICEF as we launch the 2023 Lancet Series on breastfeeding in the United States. I stand here today not only as an infant feeding specialist with UNICEF, but also a woman of color, a mother of 3 young children, 2 of whom are twins, born small and vulnerable, and had to be at the NICU here in the United States. Breastfeeding my small infants did not come easy. I'd already had a career in infant feeding, and I knew breastfeeding was the best start for my babies. I also knew how much support I could need from my family, healthcare workers, and my workplace. And because of this, I got the help I needed to successfully breastfeed my twins. Other women like me overcome their difficulties with the knowledge or the suitable enabling environment and support. But this is not the case for most families in the United States. As a mother and an infant feeding specialist, I know how seriously families take the decision on how to feed their babies. Unfortunately for many, this choice is an illusion. They do not have the support that I was fortunate to have. Yet, we know that when women are provided with the support they need, a vast majority can successfully breastfeed. Today, we will hear from our esteemed study authors and panelists about how enabling breastfeeding is a collective societal responsibility. We will learn about the challenges that mothers in the US face. And together, we will learn how we can all take on our part of that collective responsibility. We also know that when governments invest in protecting breastfeeding, change is possible. Recent estimates by UNICEF and WHO show that the percentage of infants under 6 months of age who are exclusively breastfed has risen by 10 percentage points in the last 10 years and is now 48% globally. This is indeed a great improvement, one that we can be so proud of as we continue to work to reach the World Health Assembly target of 50% by 2025. Much of the success can be attributed to policymakers globally and locally standing up to powerful industry interests to pass laws and policies to promote, protect, and support breastfeeding. We know that when the code is well implemented, it protects mothers' right to breastfeed and gives children the best possible start in life. For example, we have seen tremendous progress in many countries worldwide, including Lesotho, Togo, Turkmenistan, and Sierra Leone, my country of birth, where exclusive breastfeeding rates have increased by almost 50% since 2000. Here in the USA, we know that most women want to breastfeed their babies, as indicated by the fact that 83% of them breastfeed their newborns within 1 hour of birth. However, this number drops drastically by 6 months of age to only 24.9%. This shows that in the USA, existing policies, institutional practices, and community support systems are challenging for mothers to breastfeed their children successfully. And these numbers are even more alarming when broken down by race and ethnicity. Black and indigenous communities have the lowest breastfeeding rates due to lack of access to breastfeeding supportive environments. We know and we have seen that this perpetuates disparities in breastfeeding rates and fuels many other nutrition, health, and social inequities for both mothers and children. almost all mothers and families here in the US deserve to be protected by strong laws and policies that support their infant feeding choices and practices. And we know breastfeeding is singularly the most effective public health intervention. And we must give all children everywhere the best start in life. And children in the USA should not be left behind. This is why UNICEF is calling on governments, donors, and civil society partners in the USA and worldwide to step up investment in policies, programs, and services that protect, promote, and support breastfeeding for all women, for all children, everywhere. But what does this look like? Stand up to commercial interests and pass laws to protect caregivers from the aggressive tactics used by formula companies that you will hear more about soon. But again, the International Code on Breast Milk Substitutes tells us how to do this, and we know it works. Implement baby-friendly policies that give mothers the time, the space, and support to breastfeed children in all settings. Today, we really hope that we can have frank discussion about how we can apply these learnings in the United States context. I want to assure you all here today that UNICEF stands ready to work with you all to give millions more children the best start in life for every child, everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Padmata. Your story is a really powerful reminder of how even when a mother is an infant feeding expert, incredibly knowledgeable about breastfeeding, that often isn't enough. Your story shows that it's really important for lactating families to have systems that support them, from paid family leave to skilled breastfeeding counseling. And it's also important to note, as we talk about these things, that the Lancet papers that you're about to hear about are not about infant formula as a product. They're not about criticizing families who can or who can't or who choose not to breastfeed. Infant feeding is a particularly charged issue in the United States. We know that there are many families who have faced challenges trying to breastfeed and who stop sooner than they would have liked. The decision about how to feed an infant is not one that anyone takes lightly, no parent, no family member. And it's really important for people outside this room, as well as inside this room, we know this, but outside this room to understand this as well. So this series is about unraveling the reasons why, even though the great majority of women in the US choose to initiate breastfeeding, they're often prevented from reaching their breastfeeding goals, their lactation goals. So next, we'd like to hear from the three of the authors of the Lancet series. Dr. Rafael Perez Escamilla is a tenured professor at the Yale School of Public Health. His research program has led to large-scale improvements in infant and young adult feeding around the world. Dr. Cecilia Tomore is an associate professor at Johns Hopkins School of Nursing and the Bloomberg School of Health. Her work integrates anthropological as well as public health approaches to breastfeeding and to health inequities. And our third presenter is Dr. Catherine Russ, who serves as professor and the chair of the Department of Economics at the University of California at Davis. She'll bring her expertise in economics and international trade to today's discussion, as she did for the White House during the Obama administration in 2015 and 2016. Thank you. Here we go.
Thank you very much, Nina, for your kind introduction. Good morning to you all here in New York. Greetings to all the hundreds of people that are following us during this live stream. If we can go to the next slide, please. Doctors Cecilia Tomori, Katie Ross, and myself would first want to acknowledge all our fellows co-authors of the series. This has been a massive undertaking that really has lasted over 2 years, involving the collective hard thinking, thoughtfulness, and work of 25 unselfish authors located across 12 countries, across all world regions. We would also like to thank the Lancet for the opportunity to submit the series, and the staff here at UNICEF headquarters in New York for their support, organizing and hosting today's event. Next, please. Infant feeding matters. And as part of that, breastfeeding is indeed crucially important, as Fatmata and Nina have just mentioned. In 2016, the first Lancet series on breastfeeding described just why that is so. For those of you who may not be so familiar, breastfeeding has a very significant influence on human systems biology that has lifelong impact on health and development. It is true for infants in low, middle, and yes, high-income settings like the US alike. Breastfeeding also affects maternal health, reducing the risks of breast and ovarian cancer, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes, among others. At a simple root level, in terms of survival, the 2016 series estimated that if you can click the bottom, please, that if all children were actually breastfed according to World Health Organization recommendations, then around 800,000 child deaths would be prevented every year. Next. This series has come to be because of the observation by many that over the past 20 years, infant feeding practices have changed, and the recognition that globally fewer than half of infants are fed according to the WHO recommendations. So it's a really important issue. 2 points in terms of terminology. We use the term commercial milk formula instead of the term that is often used, breast milk substitutes. First, to highlight the artificial and ultra-processed nature of all commercial formula products, but also because the term substitute conveys the notion of equivalence, and the 2016 and this Lancet series show how the evidence has strengthened and our understanding deepened about how breast milk is so different from formula products and its impact that it has on human health. Second, to clarify what we mean by marketing in this presentation, we refer to any form of commercial communication or activity that is designed or has the effect of increasing recognition, appeal, consumption of particular products, and this includes advertising, distribution, promotion, lobbying, and sponsorship. But it does not include the transportation or sale of the product itself. So as Nina mentioned, this series is not advocating removing formula milk from the shelves or supermarkets or restricting its access to the families that need it. This is all about exposing the marketing playbook followed by the infant formula companies. And if we can go to the next, we want all of you at the end of this presentation to please remember that there are 4 main messages that we distill out of the series. The first is that breastfeeding success is a collective responsibility. It should never be considered the sole responsibility of women themselves. There are many externalities that constrain practices. If we want to improve infant feeding, then we need both policy and societal responses to support individual women and families. The second message is that like learning to walk or speak, sleeping and crying have normal trajectories, but these behavioral cues are easily interpreted or reframed by the industry to sell their products. The third message is that formula milk marketing influences our beliefs, our values, our practices. It has negatively changed the infant feeding ecosystem. However, the extent of influence and both the power of marketing and the power to market has not been fully appreciated by those in health, civil society, and governmental circles. The fourth message is that there are many constraints on women who decide to breastfeed, and it's the responsibility of governments to implement structural interventions and policies to both support breastfeeding and also mitigate negative undermining influences. So if we go to the next slide, I will now start with the first paper in the series. And there should be a slide before this one. Can you go to the previous slide, or this is? Okay, so the title of the first paper is Breastfeeding is Crucially Important or Increasingly Challenged in a Market-Driven World. So the paper starts with a multi-level conceptual framework that adds to the framework developed by the 2016 series, the interactions between the mother and infant driven by baby behaviors and their impact on exclusive and continued breastfeeding. It actually documents how these interactions drive practices to identify effective policies and interventions to protect, promote, and support breastfeeding. Next slide, please. Like any paper published in the Lancet, it is supported by a robust methodology that included analysis of nationally representative surveys, about 10 different commission systematic reviews and case studies. If we go to the next slide, we can see the evidence behind the first big message, which is about a late initiation of breastfeeding globally and the early introduction of prelacteal feeds, which means giving liquids such as water or formula milks before starting breastfeeding. We see in the figure on the left, the blue horizontal bars represent the proportion of infants initiating breastfeeding within the first hour of life as recommended by WHO. Less than half of newborns are put to the breast within the first 60 minutes. These data come principally from low and middle income countries simply because we don't have good data from high income countries. But it is very likely that if we had good data from high income countries, this scenario would look even worse. On the right, we see in all income settings a clear correlation between giving any prelacteal feeds and breastfeeding. For you have higher rates of any prelacteal feeding, the top left-hand corner, you have lower rates of early initiation of breastfeeding on the x-axis, and this is associated with shorter durations of breastfeeding and increased consumption of formula products. Next, please. As I mentioned, the paper one examines infant behaviors in a way few other publications had done before. This is important because we all need to understand that because babies are born in a very mature physiological and behavioral state, there is a significant process of post-birth maturation that they need to undergo. So it takes time, guidance, and support for young babies to learn to feed, to settle down, and to sleep. Sleep patterns of babies, as we all know, don't align with the patterns that we have as adults. Newborns express their discomfort through crying, and that signals the need for help and care. So crying is adaptive. It communicates many needs, not just hunger. Next, please. The problem is that for parents who are tired and anxious themselves, it's a very difficult time to understand and read those cues well. In a systematic review of reports from 22 countries, among healthy young infants, normal behaviors like regurgitation or crying are common. For example, at least 50% of infants pause it or regurgitate. The average time that normal babies cry or that parents label them to be fussy is about 2 hours each day. Those are understandably distressing for parents, but they are not abnormal. That's a normal process of development of babies. Unfortunately, claims that these baby behaviors are abnormal or pathological consistently undermines parental self-efficacy. Next, please. For this reason, it is not surprising that women report how their infants' behaviors shape their own assessment of their own milk supply, and how crying, fussiness, poor sleep undermine confidence. But it's not only the mothers, it's also the partners, family members, as well as health providers who misinterpret those cues. In this analysis, self-reported insufficient milk was the single most common reason, which was given by 48% of women globally for first introducing formula milks in the first 6 months, and by a third of mothers for actually stopping breastfeeding altogether. The irony is that there is strong evidence of very effective counseling and support intervention that really help parents understand those normal behaviors and improve breastfeeding outcomes as a result. Next, please. A central concern highlighted in this paper is how then normal baby behaviors are being used as a marketing opportunity by claiming that they are abnormal for profits for the sale of commercial infant formula products. New parents are legitimately concerned about those maturing baby behaviors, but maybe are just not understanding these cues because they have not received counseling, the support on how to do that. Indeed, in this article, we documented how marketing reframes these behaviors. The baby is crying too much, not sleeping because they are still hungry. And it presents this as abnormal, pathologicals, or that mothers are somewhat inadequate. So for example, some of the messages that come across are, if you're not sure whether you have enough milk, then maybe your baby needs formula without any further analysis of assessment of the child or questions asked. If your infant has a rash or cries or is unsettled, maybe your child has an allergy. Maybe your child is even allergic to your breast milk. We have the right products to solve your problem. So these inferences, these innuendos are setting the stage to sell products as solutions for offering parents peace of mind or certainty. And without skill support, reassurance, parents change from breastfeeding to formula milks or from one formula to another, with one product oftentimes being more, a new product oftentimes being more expensive than the previous one that they were purchasing. So if we go to the next slide, what we see in a series of case studies developed for paper GAP 1 is that where countries make investments, they can actually improve substantially and rapidly breastfeeding rates. We focused on 4 countries, Burkina Faso, Mexico, the Philippines, and the US, as these were countries that had significant improvements in exclusive breastfeeding prevalences over the previous decade. And we can see a gamut, a range of multi-level, multisectoral interventions that need to be implemented simultaneously and in a very well coordinated way to improve breastfeeding outcomes, including the creation of mother support groups, social and behavior change communication campaigns, landscape analysis to inform policies with robust evidence, strong position statements from academics, national academies of medicine, extending paid maternity leave, as well as extending or adding benefits for women working in the informal economy, strengthening breastfeeding services in maternity facilities and community-based settings. In the US, we will see how nicely the country has invested in the baby-friendly hospital initiative and in increasing breastfeeding support through the WIC program, although the WIC program at the same time is the largest distributor of infant formula in the world. And also it's very important to use data effectively to actually monitor and guide the implementation and oversight of these programs. This, if we can go to the next slide, then takes us into the second paper of the series that focuses on an examination of the marketing of formula products that will now be presented by my colleague, Dr. Cecilia Tomar.
Thank you so much for having us today. We're going to turn to paper 2, and our paper's title is Marketing of Commercial Milk Formula, a system to capture parents, communities, science, and policy. Next, please. Thank you. I'm a little talker. So this paper, structured similarly to paper 1, has its own objectives and methods as all papers in the Lancet do. And we describe in this paper and unpack the commercial milk formula marketing playbook and its influence across all these domains that the title suggests. Just as paper 1, this paper also has multiple methods that were employed to build a rigorous evidence base for our recommendations that included systematic reviews, analyses of commercial milk formula sales, data from all sorts of different sources, as well as 2 very large multi-country studies and case studies. Next, please. We have some key findings that we would like to emphasize from this paper. The first is that commercial milk formula marketing system is a much more extensive and much more complex system than previously we thought. It is multifaceted, it is sophisticated, extremely well-resourced, and it constitutes a whole system that becomes self-reinforcing. It constitutes an extremely powerful system of influence. And this system of influence has become even more powerful in the digital space. The second main message is that this marketing playbook is, of course, similar to other products marketing playbooks. And that is an important similarity. However, the impacts are different. There are lifelong effects on health, development, and the rights of children and their mothers. And at the same time, these practices also violate the code of marketing that we have learned about just previously that was agreed to by the UN World Health Assembly. Finally, it's really important to emphasize that this powerful system has been extremely successful. It's been very successful over many decades, actually, in reshaping both individual, societal, and medical norms and values. Next. This paper also has a conceptual framework. And I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but what I think I'd like to highlight most is that it is once again a system, not simply individual components or one part of practices, but all together. And that in this system, we all become targets, from individuals to families, to society, to health professionals, to other businesses, and even governments and politicians. all of us become targets, all of us can be captured. And ultimately, this serves to alter all the decisions that we make, that then ultimately leads to increased profits for shareholders, but unfortunately at a very great cost. Next, please. The marketing system is so powerful that we now, and this data are a few years old, we are about $55.6 billion of sales in 2019. That is a very, very large number. You can actually see on the bottom graph the increases in sales of all different kinds of formula products. And it's really important to emphasize that those sales are not total sales, but sales per capita, which means an enormous increase in how much product people are consuming per person. At the same time, we're also seeing on the top graph that with greater exposure to marketing, we have a reduced prevalence of breastfeeding. And of course, there's many reasons for this, right? That are not all single factors. There are preferences, but also major structural factors like work constraints. And we just heard about the role of perceived insufficient milk, and of course, poor support. But it's important to understand that marketing plays a central role in this. And that we know that a large portion of annual sales are actually spent on marketing, between about 4 and 7% of annual sales at the very least. And that translates to about $2.6 to $3.5 billion in US dollars per year. This is likely an underestimate because we do not have all the data on all the expenditures that include lobbying, social media, sponsorship of health workers. Next, please. This part focuses on the actual impact of this system on parents and communities. And you can see quotes from around the world. You can see in the first quote from the mom in Mexico about all these scientific acronyms like DHA. She's not really sure what they mean, but they sound appealing. And that makes her believe that this is a product that she should buy. Similarly, the woman in Vietnam talks about the benefits that her baby will get if she wants to purchase that product because it will promote brain development, height, or digestive system. And that is what she's looking for in the formulas. And you can see that both of these mothers' beliefs about health and infant behavior have been captured. In the next quote from South Africa, you see somebody who is really excited about the premium brand. That premium brand that has an expensive look, the feel of gold. And that makes her believe that this is superior quality. And so here, once again, we see a process of capture. And finally, the mother in London talks about how she was having these advertisements pop up out of nowhere. And the tracking of consumer behavior is happening right in front of our eyes. So these are actual people's experiences, and we've collected thousands of them. Next, please. Here we have examples of this process encapsulated even further. And this connects back to paper one, all the things that we heard about. These are actually mock-ups of products, but common elements that we've observed across the world. You see all the different elements, scientific acronyms, other suggestions of science, the appeal to premium with the colors, the discussion around infant behavior, about crying, about colic, about soothing. These are elements that are orchestrated in a very purposeful manner. And you also can see the very common suggestion of greater intelligence. Here, the baby who's wearing glasses and solving equations already is going to become smarter quicker. So you can really see that these marketing elements are being very carefully crafted with particular purpose. And indeed, we actually have documentation that from some CEOs themselves where they stated that actually infant nutrition wasn't necessarily about the ingredients for innovation. What we are selling is actually sleep. If the baby doesn't sleep for 3 nights and the mother is exhausted, they will go ahead and purchase the product. So going back to the same quote we heard, this is really about selling peace of mind. Very different from maybe what we might expect these products are supposed to be. Next, please. To another element of the system, healthcare workers are particularly important in this system. And the reason why is because they serve as category entry points in marketing language. They create an automatic association with particular products, and they make authoritative recommendations. We all turn to healthcare providers to understand our baby's behavior and how to best respond to them. At the same time, unfortunately, healthcare workers are also being influenced by the same system through a whole series of activities that include sponsorship of all sorts of activities, conferences, professional societies, to research itself, to the science that we see in front of us, to guideline groups. While healthcare professionals do not necessarily believe that these sources of sponsorships are actually constituting forms of influence, they indeed constitute conflicts of interest. And we have a lot of evidence about how that actually shapes responses of health professionals. In fact, formula makers are quite aware of these associations. And so this is a stakeholder mapping that comes from South Africa, where this is a marketing company that was hired by a formula maker, and they actually place the scientific and academic community right at the center of what they're hoping to constitute as a system of influence, because they know that that system will influence professional organizations, healthcare providers, and ultimately consumers themselves. Next, please. Finally, at a higher level of policymaking, commercial milk formula industry influences those areas as well. So international policy frameworks are also being manipulated to decrease their effectiveness. And we see this through a vast array of documents that we have assembled, from systematic reviews to case studies and analyses of public access information. This all demonstrates that the code is being blocked, reinterpreted, or circumvented, and even ignored. And the Codex Alimentarius is manipulated to establish weak standards that become the ceiling for regulation for commercial milk formula marketing. Next, please. Continuing on that theme, the evidence also demonstrates that the industry actually capitalizes on the lack of implementation of maternity protections and maternity leave conventions that we know protect breastfeeding. And finally, industry lobby groups are extremely numerous and influence policy environments in favor of the commercial milk formula industry and their shareholders. Next. So coming to the key lessons from this paper, we have worked hard to uncover and piece together the system of influence that commercial milk formula marketing has created. It's very important to understand that this, again, is not a criticism of marketing per se, and nor is it a criticism of women and their decisions and circumstances. What we want to highlight is that the commercial milk formula industry deploys a very complex and sophisticated system that ultimately turns the birth of an infant and the care of parents into a business opportunity. And this is the system that undermines breastfeeding and human rights. For us to be able to respond to this complex and sophisticated system, we need a systems approach ourselves to address the commercial milk formula playbook. Next, please. And now we turn to paper 3 that will be presented by Professor West.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for being here and for your attention to this crucial issue. So I'm an author on paper 2 with Professor Tamori. I'm pinch hitting for authors of paper 3 here. They're doing a political economy analysis and I'm an economist, so I'm stepping in. The political economy of infant and young child feeding, confronting corporate power, overcoming structural barriers, and accelerating progress. So the authors of this paper, like the previous two, start out with a conceptual framework. Next slide, please. It's that talks about how the institutions, ideas, and resources of our politics, economy, and our sociocultural and technological contexts work through 3 domains to influence the degree of breastfeeding, protection, promotion, and support that families receive when they're trying to decide on their infant feeding strategies. And of course, this, as you've heard from paper 1, directly and affects infant and maternal health. So the 3 domains are commerce, gender roles at home and at work, and then in the healthcare system. Next, please. So this study, like the past ones, it draws on a diversity of data, starting with an enormous scoping study of the literature, and then interviews with more than 80 different officials and professionals working in this space. And then finally, a multi-country study and several national case studies. Next, please. So in the domain of commerce, the authors point out that these commercial milk formula markets are highly concentrated. We're looking at an oligopoly that can be highly profitable. So here you see the largest 6 companies in the global market collectively controlled more than half, so 60% of global sales. So this is what an oligopoly looks like. Next slide. And the companies are therefore pretty large and powerful. So if we look at these 4 companies, Abbott, Danone, Nestle, and Reckitt and Kaiser together, they generated $187 million in revenue across all their products in 2022. And that's larger than the median country in the world, the median country's economy. In addition, they own assets that exceed the private wealth held on the entire African continent minus South Africa. And they employed more people than the combined health workforce of South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Lesotho. Next slide, please. And this economic power permits a pretty powerful and sophisticated political strategy, as Professor Tamori just mentioned. And there are really 2 phases of this. There's a public phase, but then there's a portion that's harder to see. And that involves a lot of lobbying and other types of advocacy. You may not be aware, but the industry was part of a coalition that was lobbying to restrict US funding to the World Health Organization several years before the pandemic started. So these kinds of things, and that was in part driven by concern about World Health Organization guidance on infant feeding under the International Code of Marketing Breast Milk Substitutes. Next slide. The author, I think we've skipped one there. Is there one after? Oh, okay. Okay, so there are different factors that can amplify corporate power across the domains when we're thinking about the amount of support that families may or may not get in deciding whether to breastfeed or not. In particular, we may see deregulation at the expense of public health, and Professor Tamori touched on that somewhat when she talked about the Codex Alimentarius standards, that there were quite some shenanigans there to make it difficult for countries at the national level to implement fully the Code of Marketing, the World Health Organization Code of Marketing of breast milk substitutes. Also, as she discussed, just having more parts of life commodified and marketized. Different loopholes in our tax system that make it easier for companies to shift profits around and really retain a higher portion of those. And then externalization of costs, like environmental implications of producing manufactured product as opposed to a shorter supply chain with breastfeeding. Next, please. In addition, they provide an analysis that shows the ratio of wealth transfers to shareholders. So this is dividends plus share buybacks divided by capital expenditures has been increasing since 1992. At the same time, the effective tax rates that companies are paying is declining. And this means that our public coffers are skinnier. We're starving the public health infrastructure at the same time that we're allowing greater concentration of wealth in the corporate sector. And that makes these lobbying activities even more lopsided when we're talking about different voices from public health versus the private sector in discussing regulatory policy and other policies that affect breastfeeding rates. And they make the argument that profits mostly end up in high-income countries, while the harms may disproportionately burden people in lower-income countries. And so that is a big issue for health equity. Next slide, please. In the domain of work and home, so gender roles at work and at home, the economic value of care work provided, including breastfeeding, is really not recognized. It's not quantified in a way that economic policymakers can understand and integrate into their cost-benefit analyses. Next slide, please. In addition, inadequate maternity protections, especially paid leave, makes it extraordinarily difficult for many parents who would like to breastfeed. And it's complicated as well by difficult working conditions that may make it difficult for lactating families. Next slide, please. In the health domain, we have a culture that doesn't always center women and families and the needs of infants. There's also a sort of normalization of public-private partnerships that really amplifies industry influence over standards of care. And this goes back again to, in part, starving our public health infrastructure. So next slide, please. So the authors of this series as a whole, so all three papers, then condense their findings into 3 recommendations. So the first is that government should provide accurate and timely information about breastfeeding and infant behaviors, better support and skills development for health professionals who are often, having to advise birth parents with very little training about breastfeeding, and parents in communities. Also, restrictions, meaningful restrictions on the marketing, and especially inappropriate marketing of commercial milk formulas, including strengthening the national implementation of the World Health Organization Code of Marketing and Breast Milk Substitutes. A better understanding of the commercial milk formula industry's marketing and political strategies by civil society, health professionals, and politicians, and then how they all interact together to present really big barriers to breastfeeding. Also, the health systems must deliver women-centered maternity care, including investing and empowering the health force to support and protect breastfeeding, plus establishing better codes of conduct to eliminate conflicts of interest that often pervade our healthcare institutions in favor of formula use as opposed to just a broad survey of what's going to be best for that family, to empower them to make their own best choices. Governments and society must recognize and value care work. They need to incorporate it into economic policy frameworks. We need to value the work that parents are doing when they're staying home with infants and including breastfeeding. And then finally, we all really think it's important to recognize the imbalance in power between private commercial interests and then those with a duty and mandate to protect the rights and needs of children and mothers. And if we don't understand that imbalance, and if we don't strive to correct that by elevating public health voices in the public policy space, then we're not going to be able to do our best for families. Next slide, please. So our vision is a world where parents and families are supported in the care of their infants, and for breastfeeding to be robustly promoted and supported and protected at all levels. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for the United States? So the series is a global series. We've had global launches. We'd like to talk to you a little bit about our own 3 personal takes on what this means for the United States. Next slide, please. So since I'm already up here, I'm just going to start with the macro and commercial policy because I'm an international trade macro person. So where does US macroeconomic policy and commercial policy prevent special barriers? Well, I think first and foremost, the United States is the only OECD economy that does not provide paid parental leave. And I just wanted to point out, I got this statistic from the CDC website. More than 3/4 of Americans believe there should be paid maternity leave for workers. So why this hasn't happened yet is really difficult to understand. And I think that's why the political economy analysis is something we can't ignore. In addition, we have pretty lax privacy laws compared to, say, the EU. Which allow targeted digital marketing of commercial milk formulas to parents when they're at their most vulnerable and sometimes may not even realize that it's happening. And the rest of the world is really turning more towards the European model. So we're not an outlier exactly, but we're on a different side of this. And then I want to also emphasize okay, so these things affect individuals directly, right? But we have some bigger policies that affect people all over the world, including US families. So our trade policy positions, you heard Professor Tamori mention the Codex Alimentarius. That's partly, the manipulation there happens partly through our trade stakeholders, our stakeholders who are interested in international trade and thinking about international trade policy. And then we go to the World Trade Organization and we say, look, you're implementing standards that are tighter than the Codex. Those standards may be considered a great idea within the Code of Marketing, but recommended by the World Health Organization, but they conflict with Codex. Therefore, you need to offer more justification. Maybe there's an implicit threat of punitive tariffs and other types of punishments for countries that might implement strategies that are tighter than the Codex would recommend, even though the World Health Organization recommends them. We play this game in our trade policy. You can see it in the records. In addition, if we're thinking about that imbalance of power and concentration of financial resources, the United States has proposed and actually helped negotiate and pin down an amazing new global minimum tax agreement that I think 135 countries have signed on to or are intending to implement in some way, but we ourselves have not implemented it. And there's a great blog coming out today by Kim Klausing, who's a former Treasury official, and she explains, where do we fall short in implementing that, and that could help prevent companies from being able to do that shell game with taxes that deprives our public coffers and ultimately helps starve our public health infrastructure. Thank you.
So thinking some more about the implications for the US, one of the biggest implications for us are the systemic inequities that we see in breastfeeding. This is from a recent paper that includes a cohort of WIC participants. And you can see in the statistics that we do not have the same opportunities to meet breastfeeding desires by race and ethnicity. In this particular study, Black and Hispanic women were significantly less likely to meet their breastfeeding intentions, both at 1 month and at 3 months. And of course, we also know that the same inequities affect Native and Indigenous populations as well. However, some of the data that we have on this is more limited. And so unfortunately, we do not have the same robust data sets that we have, but we know that these inequities are also profound. And all of this provides an understanding of how racism is a key driver of these inequities, and bias and discrimination contribute to all women not being able to meet their breastfeeding intentions. And this ultimately is a key issue if we're going to attempt to address breastfeeding inequities. Next. We see this across the entire cascade of breastfeeding outcomes. So just as we heard from previous speakers, we have actually made enormous progress at the beginning of this cascade, giving people the opportunity to start out breastfeeding, which took us many decades to get to. You can see inequities even at the very beginning, but then over time, the declines are enormous and the inequities in those declines are even more profound. Again, if we had better data, which we would like to have, on Native and Indigenous communities, we would see the same kind of inequities over time. So it's important to see that this is happening from the start, all the way across to 6 months, to 12 months, and of course, in exclusive breastfeeding rates as well. Next, please. Some of the things that have been making a major progress and positive changes are the implementation of the baby-friendly hospital initiative in the US. This is a major success story. We heard about this a little bit earlier, but you can really see this on the graph. We start out with, very few facilities, and then there's almost an exponential rise. I love that kind of exponential rise. And you can really see that we now have over 1 million babies born each year in a baby-friendly facility, and we have nearly 600 baby-friendly facilities in the United States, and that makes about 28% of births taking place in baby-friendly hospitals. The challenge about this is, of course, we still have a very long way to go, so we need more investment in scaling up baby-friendly facilities, but also that these facilities are not equally distributed. So not only across states, but also within states. And so the communities that they serve are not the same communities, and not every community has access to these wonderful facilities. And of course, those communities are disproportionately Black and brown. Next. There are some very hopeful and encouraging signs in the recent past. In 2022, the White House has launched a strategy on hunger, nutrition, and health. We have one of our wonderful co-authors who participated in some of these processes. And this document explicitly recognizes the importance of expanding breastfeeding support and counseling for mothers. Click again, please. Thanks. It's also really important that not only is the support and counseling piece being recognized, but the other larger broad barriers that we've been talking about. So the recognition that parents who choose to breastfeed continue to face substantial barriers in sustaining this choice, including inconsistent hospital practices, lack of insurance coverage, and inadequate access to paid parental leave. These are really critical things to recognize, because this is the kind of foundation of the systems approach that we are supporting here. Next, please. Unfortunately, on less positive notes, we also know that families continue to experience rampant, virtually unfettered exposure to formula marketing. And all of this marketing is taking place within the systems that we talked about. So the marketing is amplifying already extremely difficult structural circumstances that include no paid leave and the fundamental social inequities that we've seen that are driven by systemic racism. All of this leaves our first food systems extremely vulnerable. And of course, this is highlighted by a number of intersecting emergencies that we talked a little bit about earlier, including the accelerating impacts of climate change and aging water structure, also accelerated by systemic racism in the water crisis and the formula crisis from last year. And this particular investigative piece on the Justice Department's investigation over the situation that led to the crisis also shows that the marketing of products and the display of products is actually very prevalent even during this crisis. So if you click the next slide, you can actually see some of the same health claims that we talked about earlier in this news article claims about brain development, about eyesight and growth, etc. Next, please. Another area where we have major challenges is the extensive influence on health professionals through sponsorship of professional societies, conferences, research funding. And again, all of this takes place in a situation where there's not a lot of access to high quality lactation training, that many health professionals simply just don't have that as part of their core curriculum. And the World Health Assembly has adopted many resolutions after the initial implementation of the code. And in 2016, we have two relevant ones that I wanted to highlight. One is that health professional associations should not accept gifts or incentives from companies that market food for infants and children. And the second one, which is health professional associations should not allow such companies to sponsor meetings of healthcare professionals and scientific meetings. This is unfortunately extremely common in the United States, and I just brought two examples, one from the American Academy of Pediatrics in their children's fund, where there are multiple commercial milk formula makers, and the leading nursing organization that serves women in maternity care facilities and for neonatal care also have had and continue to have associations with formula manufacturers. Next, please. And finally, on the higher policy level that we talked about, that we just heard about in the previous presentation, we have had a series of activities in the US that have been challenging and undermining the code really from its inception, starting with the fact that the United States voted against the initial implementation of the code in 1981, but has taken a series of actions since then that have continued to undermine the code and all the subsequent World Health Assembly resolutions that we just talked about. And overall, we have a very, very loose regulation of industry activities across all sectors. And then finally, the example that we have here is about aggressive trade policy to prevent other countries from fully implementing the code. And this is just an example from news coverage from a few years ago, where the US took a series of actions to oppose signing on to a very popular breastfeeding resolution. And this, of course, left everyone stunned. And the threats involve various forms of aid that were being threatened to be taken away. So these kinds of activities obviously create major difficulties, not only within the United States, but also in the world. Next, please. And now we come to the end of these presentations, and I will turn it over to our wonderful moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Perez Escamilla, Dr. Tamari, and Dr. Russ for really distilling these excellent papers and helping us make the connections to how these issues are playing out in the US. They really underscore that we have a collective responsibility to create a supportive environment, a policy framework, a system and structure so that families have true infant feeding choices in the United States. And they also sort of show us how honestly difficult overcoming some of the tactics are going to be, these very sophisticated tactics of the commercial milk formula companies, and how important it is to do that. So now we're going to hear from a panel of experts and advocates who are really going to take us even deeper into what's happening in the US, giving us a closer look at how these issues, these problems that you've outlined in these papers are playing out for families in the US. And I'm going to call the panelists up And then I will join you at the end of the yes, here we go. So first we have Dr. Very good. Okay. So to my immediate right, we have Dr. Sakita Lewis-Johnson. She's a lactation consultant and advocate from the United States Breastfeeding Committee. From next to her, from the CDC, is Dr. Ruth Peterson. Next to Dr. Peterson, from the National WIC Association, is Stacy Davis. Next, we have Dr. Lori Feldman-Winter, who's a pediatrician and professor at the Cooper Medical School of Rowan University. And then we have Cami Goldhammer, who is the founder of Hummingbird Indigenous Family Services in Seattle. And then from Moms Rising, we have Tina Sherman. Hello? All right. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about what's happening in our communities. And if I hope it's okay with you if I address you by your first names. So Sakita, you're a lactation consultant and a health provider in Detroit. You're also, I understand, a native of Flint, Michigan. Which of course had a really dire water crisis a few years ago that really affected infant feeding profoundly, and also I think for the first time in a long time in the US really raised our attention around food security and water security issues. We've heard today that a majority of families want to breastfeed in the United States. They're doing some level of breastfeeding in the US. What do you hear from families in your community about what it's like as they try to meet their lactation goals?
So I hear a lot of coercion to give formula sometimes, lack of, I'm not speaking loud enough, lack of real protections, lack of support, a lot of it that's been spelled out in the papers. What I will say is that a majority of the families that I see have often called me and said, hey, I need support, I need assistance. And sometimes, most times that's direct assistance in the home or telehealth because of mismanagement of lactation. And so sometimes there is early cessation of milk production because of mismanagement and lack of timely access to skilled support and care. Other things that I know is that, I was glad Dr. Tamori talked about, racism, because a lot of the food oppression that we see, particularly when I say food and oppression, I mean those things that can be prevented. Immediate LARC right after delivery. There's just this push and focus and not enough talking about lactational amenorrhea. Lots of things that lead to the absence of true choice, informed choice, which to me indicates that is one of those things that is a food oppression, which is kind of different and adds to food insecurity for our infants in this country. And so for the most part, families, it's just a lack of support, lack of information, also misinformation that's often given to them by certain individuals.
What kind of misinformation?
For instance, let's talk about LARC, and I'm going to say this in some
LARC is
so it's what I'm going to talk about. It's the long acting reversible contraceptive section. And so when I'm speaking in particularly of a medication that's being given right after delivery. And there's this notion, for instance, ACOG, which is the American Colleges of Gynecology, states that parents should be informed about the theoretical risk of low milk supply. And I would argue that it's not so theoretical. I would argue that there's data and that not all the data is coming from these random control trials. They're coming from the lived experiences of particularly Black women that are being given this medication, which happens to have a black box warning on it. But what it does is I can see it play out. It's leading to low milk supply. And so, when I talk about food oppression, I mean, that is a true lack of choice. There's not enough focus on really telling folks we're putting this in your body. There's other ways you can prevent in pregnancy.
And to clarify that, they're being told about birth control before they're being told about lactation support. And the birth control that they're being provided in many of these settings actually affects their milk supply, and they don't know that either.
Correct.
Okay, absolutely right. Dr. Peterson, now you give us the 300,000, actually, I guess it's more like the 30,000 BPU of what does the CDC data tell us about what families are experiencing around the US as far as infant feeding?
Great, thank you. Great question. And I'm so happy you've already seen some CDC data from the slides that were presented. So we obviously track trends that are in the United States. And we're happy from 2009 to 2015, we saw a steady increase in breastfeeding rates. So since 2016, we have seen a leveling off or decreases in certain racial and ethnic groups. The good news is in the United States, we met our Healthy People 2020 goal. So we had 83% of women who reported ever breastfeeding. But what the country's realized is ever breastfeeding, and you heard about that from Raphael, is different than the importance of initiation and duration. So now what we're looking at is more data around initiation, and we're seeing this disparity, and I'll just highlight the Black versus white. We've got 74% African-American initiation rate and 85% for white women. So we have a lot of room that we need to continue to improve in. So we're happy because we know that we've had improvements in the Black initiation rate from 2009. It was 60%, and now it's 74%. So that's all an improvement. But we have to continue, we've heard that repeatedly today, to have these system level changes. And at CDC, we are driven to make those system level changes, focus on the disparities, number one, and number two, and it's been mentioned, 60% of women in this country do not meet their breastfeeding goals. So we focus strategically on that. And we know that we need better data for local action on those two things. So we have the National Immunization Survey, which is where we get most of our data, but we're very excited. We work with WIC and we have county level data that is now on our website that is publicly accessible, showing where we have initiation. So what that means is we finally have tools out there for local decision makers and advocates and public health and clinicians to point to where the disparities are the worst and where initiation rates are the lowest. You will not be shocked that they generally overlay with where disparities are also bad for chronic diseases and obesity. So it's this life course perspective. So I could talk all day about this, but I'm going to be respectful of our time and stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Stacy. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as we heard, USDA, is the largest purchaser of infant formula in the United States, and I think actually in the world, on behalf of WIC families. But we've also heard that WIC is the largest provider of breastfeeding support in the United States. So first of all, tell us a little bit about WIC families, and then I realize that's a general question, but and then kind of what the challenges that these families are typically facing as they initiate breastfeeding, as they want to continue breastfeeding, and what they tell you about what they need to achieve success.
So WIC families are a diverse population of folks around the country. So they live in urban communities, they live in rural communities, they live in suburban communities. And so we like to look at WIC folks as, of course, they have some level of poverty in order to qualify for the services, but not to the level at which other governmental assistance programs have. And so their incomes are allowed to be a little higher than normal in order to support and provide the additional nutrition, education, and breastfeeding support that families need in order to survive. So like in the Lancet report, there are some barriers and challenges that they face. So attitudes around society's beliefs around breastfeeding support, of course, lack of social support, lack of family support, lack of community resources, especially when we're looking at geographical locations, so eliminated rural communities. Someone can drive 3 hours to the nearest baby-friendly hospital or breastfeeding support group. Of course, those things have improved, with COVID and more things being virtual and accessible, and that means, but we still have challenges in that internet is not an accessible resource everywhere. There's still challenges about people having access to adequate internet. And so that continues to be a challenge. But WIC is working diligently to close those gaps in services and support so that more families are able to have access to that. And so, yes, WIC employs the largest number of lactation providers and supporters than any other organization or entity in maternal and child health. And so we have peer counselors and we have certified lactation educators and similar. We also have international board lactation consultants. And all those services are free to WIC eligible families.
That's great. And follow up, but I will go to you, Dr. Feldman-Winters, Lori. So as a pediatrician, families come to you all the time with their feeding problems, right? And what do you hear from families? What advice do you give them? But also, what do you hear from your fellow providers and doctors in particular?
Yeah, so the evidence shows that mothers actually adhere to their pediatrician and doctor's advice more than any other advice that they're getting. So it's really incumbent upon doctors to have the knowledge and skills to be able to provide the best support that they can, culturally congruent and sensitive manner. The problem is that there's a huge gap in physician education around breastfeeding. And we know that from work that the CDC sponsored, that in a landscape analysis of primary care doctors, that nearly half of the physicians were capable of handling breastfeeding concerns and even doing an assessment of breastfeeding problems. And we also know that 55% of those in practice less than 5 years. So the recent grads have not been trained during their residency programs to be prepared to handle breastfeeding problems. And those that trained when I did more than 20 years ago had next to nil. And the only information that we received in our training was really at the hands of the commercial milk formula industry. It was really the industry that taught us about breastfeeding and nutrition. So there's a lot of well-meaning doctors out there that just haven't had the proper education, don't possess the skills, but have a great opportunity to either do great work by maintaining breastfeeding when problems arise, or unfortunately be the source of when breastfeeding unravels. by recommending supplementation. And too often that's the case. And I often get those referrals after the fact, both through my children who now have friends that are having babies, through my friends who are now the beneficiaries of being grandparents. And what I hear and what I'm trying to support families to do is to reclaim breastfeeding by overcoming so many of the misinformation, so much of the advice that had been given along the way, so that we can do simple things such as just improve the basic position of the baby, something that would seem so basic, but that is important in order to have a good latch, to have good milk transfer, so that the baby can grow and thrive. And I do think that while pediatricians in a well-meaning way want to fix breastfeeding problems, that takes time, and the healthcare system isn't structured necessarily to be able to provide that time to do that good work. And there is a culture of equivalency. I think the culture is that, well, formula supplementation can't be that bad, and they really don't have a full understanding of how bad it is, and how the health outcomes are very different, in fact, particularly with early supplementation, when we know that contributes to premature weaning and mothers not realizing their goals to breastfeeding.
And this is sort of in the postpartum period, right? Just where it really becomes important. And the hospital, you might have a lactation consultant or a nurse or someone who's kind of helping, but afterwards, is it really like how much are doctors, the people that women are listening to, families are listening to, versus the other medical providers who are there to offer support in a medical setting, in a doctor's office?
Yeah, I would submit to you that it's all along the journey, from even preconception throughout prenatal period. There's opportunities to talk about how to breastfeed during the prenatal period in a way that's effective. And we actually had good evidence that shows that if the maternal care provider talks about how to breastfeed, not just why to breastfeed, but how to do it, mothers are much more likely to initiate breastfeeding. In the hospital, it's so important that the physicians aren't pushing back against all these wonderful policies like the 10 steps to successful breastfeeding that we know helps get breastfeeding started. And unfortunately, it's often the case because of lack of exposure and the culture that they're pushing back against things such as rooming in or skin to skin care, the things that help establish the early hours or days of breastfeeding. And then definitely throughout the postpartum period, there's so many examples of families that have turned to me at every point along that journey where I have to recapture breastfeeding that has fallen apart because unfortunately, misinformation, bad advice that's been given.
Great, thank you. So Cami, you're nationally recognized for your work advocating for Indigenous families, including a program that you started that specifically trains Indigenous lactation counselors. Tell us about the program and why it's a priority.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I just want to say, good afternoon, relatives. I, along with my best friend, Kimberly Morsalis, who's a Navajo lactation consultant, her and I travel all over what we call Indian country, which is Turtle Island, North America, training Indigenous people as lactation peer counselors. There's a huge lack of diversity in the field of lactation. I know that's probably, we haven't explicitly talked about that, but as far as we know, there's about between 20 and 25 native lactation consultants, IBCLCs in the United States and Canada. That's out of about 20,000, right? And so there's a huge gap there. And we know that receiving culturally congruent care, receiving care from your community, is an important step, right? We learned from our researchers who presented that being able to receive support, right, is really, really key. And so what Kim and I do is travel all over, training Indigenous lactation counselors. We've trained, you have to be Native or Indigenous to take our course. It's a 5-day, 45-hour foundational lactation training, and we've trained 499 Indigenous lactation counselors. So we have one next week. So we'll cross over 500 in Minneapolis. They'll be our 500, ILC or IndiGLCs as we call them. But, we really feel that the community has the answers. The community is the one to be able to provide support. And if we really talk about breastfeeding as a traditional practice, which it is, right? It's a cultural traditional practice. It's not a way to feed a baby. It's not, there's so much more tied up in this than just like a baby's nutrition. But if we really look at it as a traditional cultural practice, then it is a traditional cultural practice to provide support as well, right? That is the information that we should be getting. I was thinking about Dr. Lori's comment about being a grandparent. The ones that should be helping with breastfeeding are the grandmas. They are the aunties. That's who should have this knowledge. They should be helping a baby position, right? But we have this huge gap for the last 150 years where we've kind of thrown all of this information away, right? And the way I see this is just dormant. And now we're here in this time to be able to bring it back to life.
Right. Yeah. That's exciting. 500. Wow. And how old is your program?
This is our 6th year of teaching. So our first training was in fall of 2017.
Okay.
And we're 2 trainings into our 6th year.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's really good. That's really great news. Congratulations. So Tina Sherman, in your role with Moms Rising, you hear lots of stories from mothers about their infant feeding experiences, but also in your policy role, you have seen some recent glimmers of not terrible news. So can you tell us about some of the things? As an investigative journalist, I always look for the dark side of everything. And it's great to be reminded that there are people who are doing really important work and making progress. So can you tell us about some of the things that have happened recently that we should take hope from?
Absolutely. So when we talked about the barriers that many families are facing, workplace supports is one of the many barriers that families are facing. And I want to name that many of these are structural, right? Like it's not, as the study hits on, it is not individual failures, lack of societal support. So one of the things that we are incredibly excited about is the passage of the PUMP Act, which was signed into law at the end of last year with the help of a huge amount of advocates across the country, many families. And what the PUMP Act does is provide reasonable accommodations, the time and space to express breast. And prior to this,
In the workplace,
yes,
right.
Thank you. Prior to this being passed and signed into law, we were hearing from families that were pumping in their cars in the middle of winter in Chicago, pumping in storage closets, or let's just be honest, not pumping at all. Because when 1 in 4 mothers are returning to the workplace within 2 weeks of giving birth, the inability to pump provides a false choice. And so being able to have the right to express breast milk and to pump in the workplace is a huge barrier that's been lifted. So incredibly excited about that, and definitely a win that we need to celebrate. An additional win that happened at the end of last year, also included in the omnibus legislation, was the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. And again, one of the things that we talk about that many families face is access to affordable and quality healthcare. And when we talk about quality, affordable healthcare, we're also talking about culturally competent care and being able to see a provider that looks like you and work with communities, work within communities. So one of the things that the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act does is offer the right for individual workers to take the appropriate, have the reasonable accommodations to be able to stay in the workplace, and actually have the private right of action if their employer forces them to leave the job site. So what that means is carrying around an extra bottle of water, or maybe being able to take a bathroom break so they don't contract a UTI. It also means that they might be able to take paid leave if under doctor's orders need to take sick. It's a huge win.
And it applies not just to pregnant women, but to lactating.
Yes, lactating. Yes. And pregnant people.
And then there's also Medicaid expansion, or
Yeah.
extension, I should say, postpartum Medicaid extension.
Yes, so postpartum Medicaid extension is again a huge step. Prior to the extension, 60 days is when most pregnant people lost healthcare coverage. And Medicaid is the insurer for half of pregnant people in the United States. And so losing coverage 60 days after birth, again, an arbitrary time frame, was huge. And we know from maternal mortality review statistics and the maternal mortality review committees that that loss and that inability to have healthcare at that time was a huge contributor to maternal mortality and maternal morbidity. So that extension is huge. It's now extended to a year. Unfortunately, we still have some fight in that arena. Not all states. It is so that the federal government has allowed for the extension, but states have to then adopt it, and not all states have adopted it. So we have some work yet to do to ensure that every state, does not matter where you live, to be able to still qualify for it.
That's great, thank you. So that's a good segue to our next round of questions, which is about the other kinds of policy and societal responses that we need to support individual people and their families, parents and families in making their feeding choices. So I just want to hear from each of you about what you think in your particular sphere that might look like. So Sakita, let's talk about excuse me, what is happening with the United States Breastfeeding Committee, and but also the work that you're seeing on the ground. And
so regarding policy, we have to really correct the policy failures and then prevent them from happening. You know, an example of a policy failure is, for example, the Flint water crisis. You add the water that was being used to also the commercial milk formula. You know, what are we doing to minimize and prevent that from happening again, right? One of the things that USBC does is they have action work groups that really deals with the policy levers change. How are we changing? They bring together organizations across the nation to come into these constellation work groups and really talk about what changes are needed and necessary to move this work forward. So, you know, prevention of policy failures. And secondly, I'll add that when policies are created, you have to create policies that centers the most marginalized people. If you're not building policies with that at the forefront of your policy making, your language is going to be incorrect, and there will be indirect consequences and sometimes negative consequences to policies that don't take into consideration the lived experiences of Black and Brown people in this country. You know, I'm not going to even talk about the historical context, but oftentimes when policies are made, that's not intertwined in what should be happening. Voices are not being heard of not just professionals, but parents. And then there's the element of testimonial injustice, where it depends on who's doing the talking, whether or not they're believed. And so our families need to be believed. Black and Indigenous healthcare professionals need to be believed, because we are the ones in the community doing the work, hearing the stories, and trying to inform others, hey, this is a slippery slope. These are the things that need to happen. We need more healthcare providers to be compliant with baby-friendly hospital initiative. You know, it's good to have baby hospital initiatives, but the compliance level, particularly in areas that have areas of high deprivation index, you can see the compliance is not the same. I've worked in a healthcare system that has suburban hospitals, and I worked in a city, and you could see the differences in the exclusivity rates, the initiation rates. And so we really need policies on all levels to really minimize. We also need an infrastructure. We learned a lot during this pandemic. In addition to all of the shortages that have happened, in addition to water crisis, we're not prepared. We're not prepared from an emergency standpoint. And so what are we doing about that? Are we trying to capitalize on the lessons learned? Are we trying to develop work groups so that we don't end up in that situation again? These are all things that we could be doing now without the data sets, because we have a lot of data that supports it's time for action.
So at CDC, we have 3 areas in which we really work diligently to address the disparities, and again, women and families and individuals not meeting their breastfeeding goals. So it's hospitals, work sites, and communities. And we don't do this alone. We have, speaking of a limited public health infrastructure, we don't have enough money to fix this across the country. So we depend on everybody that's around this panel and the people that just spoke on helping us. So it's national, state, and grassroots organizations to really help us implement what we know works with attention to what the community context is. So we've talked about the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative. We run the MPINK program, which is the maternal practices for infant nutrition and care. And we follow the WHO Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative designation and implement it across the United States with technical assistance. Now, you saw the graph before with the uptake. We now have 1 in 4 babies born in hospitals that have that designation, which we are thrilled about, but the demand is still there. And at CDC, because of our emphasis on the disparities, we actually look to those hospitals that are in the zones where the breastfeeding disparities are the highest. So we try to go in the hardest to reach places through the funded recipients that we have across the country. So we're very pleased with that work. We also, I want to talk about the work site work that our recipients do. We're pleased over the last 4 years with our funded recipients that over 1,000 work sites have adopted the federal lactation accommodation support because of our funding and because of our technical assistance. And again, because of everybody that's sitting at this panel, because we don't ever do it alone, and USPC is a huge leader in that work. The third area is about this community continuity of care. And we mentioned grandparents and the importance of grandparents. We also have grandparents who are not supportive of breastfeeding. And so sometimes we have individuals that we hear about who go home from a hospital setting, maternity care practice setting, that supported their breastfeeding goals, and they get home and their grandmother says, why would you possibly do that? So we have to build in through our recipients that we work with and our partners, this continuity of care model that's really attentive to what is going on at the ground level. So CDC can say it's evidence-based and it's important, but I don't know how that community needs that implemented. So that is why we trust the people at the ground level to pull those policy levers and to change the way that their state or local jurisdiction implements continuity of care support at the ground level. And again, uses data with that call to action back to our county level data to show decision makers the issues that we have at the ground level. Thanks.
So National WIC is working diligently to address the needs of families. And there's multifaceted approaches that we're doing. So of course, we're doing our policy and advocacy work, advocating for policies to support families to make sure that they are successful. I mean, they're getting their needs met. We're also working to support our local and state staff in diversifying and strengthening the WIC workforce. Because we have the greatest number of breastfeeding support services, we recognize that there are instances where our WIC staff are not reflective and representative of the communities that they're serving. And so we're putting money behind that by training WIC staff to become registered dietitians and IBCLCs, so that the staff is more reflective of their communities, and so that they're able to better support. We're also doing things like developing partnerships so that staff have access to resources, equitable resources that they need in order to provide that culturally competent care that Tina was talking about, but also making sure that the care that they're receiving is culturally sensitive and responsive. In that goes along with that, we're also working on providing EDI-B training. So making sure that staff have the training, that they're addressing their own biases that might be inhibited or perpetuating the systems of inequities and disparities. We're also working on identifying champions within local and state WIC agencies through a train-the-train model. And so identifying those folks, providing them with intensive training and resources so that they can go back to their own communities and train the people in their communities. And so it's spread universally. I could probably go on and on about all the great things that WIC is doing, but I'll say that since coming on board, my sole purpose and responsibility as a former WIC participant, but also working in WIC, for the state at the state level, and then coming to NWA is I see the resources that families need. So, and I also recognize there are resources that the staff needs in order to ensure success. And so making sure we're training folks to talk about things like newborn behaviors. We're talking about having conversations with their employers prenatally about what options they have when they come back to work after their maternity leave is over, and things of that nature so that they feel supported and so that we're closing the gap and getting higher rates of initiation, duration, and exclusivity.
Thank you so much. So the good news is that from a clinical standpoint, we have lots of policies and protocols that have been written by the American Academy of Pediatrics, ACOG, AAFP, and a variety of clinical protocols published by the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine that are very detailed and specific to the needs of women and families. The problem is that many of these policies and protocols are unknown to many of the people that are doing the work. And even if they were known, the structure and paradigm for how healthcare is delivered in a clinical setting is almost set up to fail. The time crunch of how long anyone's in for a visit and really understanding the community and really the lack of collaboration across all the other persons involved in the healthcare community to work together to help build that network of support is non-existent. And lastly, what we don't have and what we could have is accountability. We don't have accountability for physician good management or lack of good management because we really don't have data at the physician practice level. It's great to have national level data, and it's even better now to have community and county level data from the CBC. That's helpful, and to stratify that by race, ethnicities, and other socio-demographic factors to bring that out. But if we can do that at the practice level, then we can do what we're trained to do, which is really problem-based learning, and we can initiate our own improvements where we see our own gaps every single practice. And there's no mechanism right now to do that. But that would be one solution.
Great, thank you.
I want to change ever so slightly, and I want you to address, if you could, what you see as the most effective strategies for combating predatory marketing in Indigenous communities and toward people of color in general, families of color. No.
Oh, that's a good question. And there's, there is a really long history of predatory marketing in Indigenous and Black communities. And we've seen this, from on the Navajo reservation several decades ago. Pet Milk came in and hired elders to record radio advertisements, and knowing how important our elders are in our communities, right? And how much power they have, how much knowledge they have, and how just like gross that method was, right? And so I think that, and that's actually one of the other things I was thinking about when I was listening to the first presenters, is that the marketing, we often talk about the marketing of a formula to individual parents, right? Those moms that are up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and there's way more advertisements on TV for formula at that time, right? Like things like that. But this is a marketing to society, right? It is a marketing to the grandparents, to the providers, and it's just so incessant. So we absolutely do need to take control of that. We need to adopt the WHO code earnestly in the United States and do something to stop this from happening. And we need to increase access to high quality lactation support in these communities, because we're the ones who are going to be combating it, right? We're the ones who are like, that's not true. Like, I know you were told that by your doctor. I know that you read that on the can. We know, that that's just not the truth. And so we really do need to invest in communities and specifically in peer counselors, right? Whether that's through WIC or independent peer counselors, because that is who is going to be getting information to these families, right? We are the ones that are in homes. We can do a lot at the hospital level, but bottom line is day 2, most everyone's gone, right? Like most everyone's gone at that point. And that's why we see that huge drastic decrease in, the first couple weeks to, several months after the baby's born. And so I would just love to see more of an investment in people who can spread the truth about milk, right? Human milk, and commercial formula. Thank you.
Yeah. Recent wins, what more needs to be done national? What next?
So that's, again, excited about our recent wins, but know that we still have a long road to haul. And so, starting with, we want every birthing person to go home with their babies. So starting with addressing our maternal health crisis is kind of the first place that we at Moms Rising are starting at. And working with the champions of the Black maternal health omnibus, we really like to see that package of legislation championed through Congress and signed into law by President Biden. So that's kind of our first stop. We want every mother every birthing person, every parent to go home with their baby. And then secondly, once they're home, we, and being responsive to our members. Our members are telling us these things. So being responsive to our members, they're tired of being fearful, and as the study shows, tired of being fearful of losing their jobs. And so, having the access to paid family medical leave is absolutely critical. Again, with 1 in 4 birthing moms returning to work within 2 weeks of giving birth, it's critical, and it really, I often call it kind of the paid family leave being the equalizer. Without paid family and medical leave, you're really offering parents false choice in being able to meet their breastfeeding. And then I could go on, but I'll just add one more. One of the other key pieces is, with so many families, choosing to return to work now, thankfully having those lactation accommodations, we really want there to be affordable, accessible childcare. is incredibly important, and infant care is incredibly important. So those are really, again, we have a whole post, we can talk about it another time, but those are really key policy levers we're pushing.
Great, that's very strong. All right, so we're almost at the end of our panel. And before we turn it over to questions from the audience, I would like to just kind of sum up. We've heard a lot of really major problems and some really interesting, important ways that we can improve the system in the US for feeding infants and families. But I'd also just like to let you guys have the final word. So if you could highlight just one thing, one solution that you think would be most likely to move the needle, what would it be? 10 words or less, go. Sorry. No one's gonna keep count.
All right, so really, I think that all policies, well, first of all, I know that the United States hasn't ratified the infants' rights, the convention that was held. But I do think that you don't have to ratify something to really take it, it's a common sense. So I think all policies need to begin with protecting our most vulnerable people, which is our newborns. And we have to begin to frame human milk from an infant's rights.
Support breastfeeding families everywhere.
I would say increasing the amount of support and funding that peer counselor programs are receiving, so that we don't have to fight for that, every year. That is just automatic. We already know that, with agencies across the nation are going to get, $90 million every year instead of it fluctuating in the fear of that program not being able to be continued.
So we have to invest strategically so that educational competencies are achieved by all physicians.
Increase access to culturally matched, not culturally competent, culturally matched skilled lactation support.
Listen and consider families in any public policy decisions.
And with that, I'd like to thank our hosts, our presenters, and our panelists for a really great conversation.